And Ricky, thanks so much for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you and get this, we can get this going. If you want to just start by introducing yourself a little bit.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Greta, and thank you all for inviting me to speak with you today. As Greta mentioned about the RAFT, or the Residential Assistance for Families in Transition program, the focus today is going to be on the Fiscal Year 2025 program. Again, I'm Ricky Hartman, Senior Program Coordinator, Eviction Diversion. I work in EOHLC's Division of Housing Stabilization. I'm also joined today by my colleague Jackie Bottaro at EOHLC, who is the RAFT and HCEC Technical Assistance Supervisor. I'm gonna start with an overview of the current RAFT program policy, and then we're going to turn to the application portal, which is known as the Housing Help Hub. And after, I will share some resources with you, and then finally we'll take some questions on today's materials. So if we could go to the next slide. Thank you.
Can I just make sure everyone can see the slides? Can any of you see them?
Yep.
Yes. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I can see them now as well. So the goal today would be to provide you all joining the advocates working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence with guidance and continued support related to RAFT. So if we could advance to the next slide, and then the slide after, just getting started with RAFT in fiscal year 25. So before we really dive into more detailed policy, I do want to highlight three major aspects of the current program that might be a little different from what you remember in prior years. But if you are familiar with the program last fiscal year, these 3 points have not changed. So first, the maximum benefit allowed by the program is $7,000. Second, rental stipends for future rent are not an allowable program expense. And finally, the current program serves eligible homeowners in addition to renters. And our goal is to continue serving as many households upstream of the court process as possible. Next slide. And also for general context, before we get into individual policy elements, I want to highlight that all RAFT applications in the state must come through the application portal, which is called the Housing Help Hub. For landlord payment, every application needs to include a tenant application and a landlord application, which we'll be going over in greater detail a little later. Once submitted through the portal, the application is going to automatically go to one of 11 regional administering agencies, or RAAs. That depends on geography and RAA processing capacity. So please note that applications in one geographic region may get sent to another region if that region is at capacity or the applicant is a homeowner. Next slide. So now we'll turn to actually looking into the current policies. This slide shows the topics that we're going to go over. And again, I do want to highlight that you may notice that many of the elements are the same as last fiscal year, because these elements have not changed significantly. So next slide, we'll get started here with eligibility. So this is just an overview of the eligibility criteria that households need to meet in order to qualify for the RAFT program. The first is that households must be Massachusetts residents who have an eligible housing crisis or be at risk of housing instability in Massachusetts at the time of their application. Households must also be currently renting or moving to a new rental unit. And note that households can resolve their housing crisis by moving out of state with RAFT support. That's a common question that we get. To qualify for homeowner assistance, since we do serve homeowners now, homeowners have to be owner occupants of the property in question. Also, households who are at risk of harm due to domestic violence in their current housing situation must be at or below 60% AMI or area median income. And then for all other households, including those owner-occupant homeowners, they need to be at or below 50% area median income. And finally, households do not need to have legal immigration status in order to qualify for RAFT. But if any applicant or household member has a social security number, they must provide it on the application. Okay, so next slide. This is going over the housing crises. So I had mentioned that eligibility, one of the criteria for eligibility was an eligible housing crisis or risk of housing instability. So this slide shows the situations that we consider to be eligible housing crises for renters. The categories are notice to quit, eviction, doubled up and must leave, and overcrowding, health and safety, domestic violence, fire, flood, natural disaster, utility shutoff, or other crises that will result in imminent housing loss. So the next slide, we're going to just briefly highlight the categories that are applicable to homeowners in crisis, but we will come back to the verification needed for each of these categories, including those on the last slide. We'll come back to those later in the session. So the categories on this slide are the situations that we consider to be eligible housing crises for homeowners, and you'll notice that utility shutoff is a crisis for both renters and homeowners, but the homeowner crises mostly relate to mortgage arrears and foreclosure. All right, so to the next slide, we're going to turn now to the benefit cap. As I mentioned earlier, the maximum limit is $7,000 per household. Eligible households, they can receive RAFT in a combination of benefit types, as long as the total amount of assistance does not exceed that $7,000 within a rolling 12-month period. However, I do want to highlight that households cannot use RAFT to pay off arrears at a current unit and to move at the same time. So basically, you can't use RAFT to pay two different landlords at once or on one application. Households can also actually access program funds more than once in a given year, as long as they don't receive more than $7,000 in 12 months. Households with rental vouchers or subsidies, they can't receive payment for more than 6 months of rent arrears within 12 months. And we'll go into this in greater detail in a little bit. And I also want to highlight the example on the slide to help explain or show these rules. So in this situation, the household received $3,000 in RAFT on March 1st, 2025. The household applies again on January 1st, 2026. So in light of these rules, the maximum benefit that the household can receive is $4,000. $4,000 being the difference between the $7,000 max benefit and the $3,000 already received. Okay, so turning now to eligible uses of funds. In the next slide, you'll see a number of potential uses of funds here. as I mentioned, RAFT can cover, different benefit types or a combination of benefit types as long as the applicant is within that benefit cap. The funds do have to resolve the current housing crisis, so the RAAs, they're going to use RAFT for the items that are going to provide the most stability up to the $7,000 limit, and will provide only what's necessary to resolve the identified crisis. So this is a list of the most common things that RAFT covers. So that includes rent arrearage, startup costs, moving costs, utility arrears, furniture up to $1,000, appliances if the unit doesn't include an appliance required to make the unit habitable, which could be a fridge or a stove. And then for homeowners, mortgage arrears, property taxes, homeowners insurance, or other costs. And again, ultimately, the assistance is going to allow the household experiencing the crisis to either maintain their current housing or avoid homelessness by securing new housing. So the next slide is focused on the letter of intent process, which is specifically for startup costs and moving expenses. So in this process, the letter of intent process, an applicant can actually apply without a new unit, and they can be found pre-eligible before they provide details about the new unit. So applicants who indicate in the application pre-screening that they're planning to move will be given the option to complete the letter of intent application. If they've been found pre-eligible, they'll be given an actual letter of intent, which confirms that they are pre-eligible for assistance. Again, potentially to include security deposit, first and last month's rent, and moving expenses. Applicants will have 90 days to locate a unit, and once they find a unit, they need to go back into the application portal, and then they're going to provide details about their new unit by converting their letter of intent application into an actual RAFT application. And then at this time, the prospective landlord will get a code, which is going to prompt them to complete the corresponding landlord application. And if all of the landlord's information checks out with the RAA, the file can be approved without the eligibility of the tenant being rechecked. And then I do want to circle back in the next slide to households with income-based rental subsidies. As I had mentioned earlier, households who are receiving income-based rental subsidies, so that could include programs like Section 8 or Mass Rental Voucher Program, MRVP, public housing. So programs where someone's rent goes up or down depending on their income. They are eligible potentially for RAFT, but there are some more rules that apply. Firstly, households with vouchers or subsidies can't receive payment for more than 6 months of rent arrears, as I mentioned earlier. And then secondly, households in subsidized housing, in non-payment cases, so non-payment of rent cases, they must show that they had good cause for non-payment. And the reasoning behind this is that households in this scenario, their rent is adjusted based on income. So in most cases, losing income wouldn't necessarily mean that someone would need RAFT if they can request a rent adjustment with their subsidy administrator or the housing authority to get rent back to an affordable amount. And I want to highlight some examples of good cause for non-payment of rent. So that might include, but certainly not limited to, unexpected bills, unexpected expenses, fewer hours at work than usual, domestic violence, and also disability-related hardship. And if the household is not able to provide verification of good cause for the full period of rent arrears, it must submit verification showing that the RAFT benefit will solve the current housing crisis. And for example, that could be a plan for the remaining balance that RAFT can't cover. Okay, so now we'll take a closer look at income verification. So As I had mentioned earlier, we do have the income eligibility. So that would be 60% AMI or a median income for those at risk of domestic violence in their current housing situation. And for all other applicants, that would be 50% AMI. So applicants who are receiving certain Mass Health or Department of Transitional Assistance DTA programs or benefits don't actually need to provide income documentation because their participation in Mass Health or DTA is actually checked automatically through the application. Applicants in subsidized housing can also prove income eligibility by showing a recertification done with their provider within the last year of the time of application. But they'd only need to do this if they didn't match against that DTA Mass Health benefit check. And so really the key takeaway here is that if a household doesn't automatically match against the Mass Health or DTA database check, it is going to need to provide income documentation. And importantly, each income source for each household member has to be verified. So that could be, as seen on the slide, pay stubs, benefit letters, or other documentation. For pay stubs, what we're looking for here is 2 pay stubs dated within the last 60 days. That's regardless of pay frequency, and the pay stubs don't need to be consecutive. Also, Social Security benefits, for example, that could be the most recent benefit letter dated within the last 12 months. For unemployment benefits, that would be a printout from unemployment showing the weekly payment amount dated within the last 60 days. Child support through DUR or not through DUR could be a printout dated within the last 60 days or a letter from the parent paying the child support dated within the last 60 days. And you can also verify these benefits with a bank statement showing the deposit dated within the last 60 days. Other sources of income, applicants can supply a letter or other verification showing the income dated again within the last 60 days. And then finally, households who have no income or zero income or are paid in cash can have their income verified through self-certification on the application itself. Okay, so the next slide, we're going to go now through some of the required documentation, including some of the verification documentation, as I had mentioned earlier. So this is an overview of the required tenant or homeowner documentation for RAFT. So since the application is done through the application portal or the Housing Help Hub, this documentation does need to be uploaded through the portal as well. And I do want to highlight that for startup and moving applications, documentation submitted to verify the eligible housing crisis will also be used as verification of the current housing where the crisis is occurring. So documentation to verify the new unit will be needed. In a few slides, we'll also cover some examples of the documentation that can be used for verification of a housing crisis, depending on the housing crisis that is selected in the application. And in the next slide, I just want to briefly go over what is required of landlords in terms of documentation for RAFT. So again, like the tenant documentation, this documentation will be uploaded by the landlord through the Housing Help Hub's landlord portal and not the tenant portal, since the landlord would have their own portal, which we'll go over in a little bit. And then turning to the next slide. So now, as I had mentioned earlier, I want to be able to go over the documents that are required to establish that there is an eligible housing crisis, and this is for renters specifically. These are just examples. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. But notices to quit, evictions, and doubled up and overcrowding are among the most common housing crises. In the next slide, you'll see just some of the specific criteria for notices to quit. But I do want to note that for domestic violence crises, verification includes documentation to support a DV allegation connected to the inability to stay safely in current housing. Also a self-statement from the applicant if other documents aren't available. And again, these are just examples. We understand that every situation is different and that survivors may not always have specific paperwork to document what they're going through. So the RAs will work with the applicant to figure out what documentation can be provided in specific cases. And in the next slide, I just want to highlight the notice to quit criteria that the RAs are being asked to confirm. So the RAs are going to, for specifically notices to quit, confirm that the notice to quit actually includes everything listed here. I believe that the slides will be shared after the presentation for reference in the event that you'd like to compare what is on the notice to quit with the criteria listed here. And then in the next slide, this is just the verification documentation list for homeowners. And so again, you'll see that the focus here is mostly based on mortgages and foreclosure. So for example, for the housing crisis category of being behind 3 or more months on a mortgage, the documentation would be a mortgage statement showing the 3 months missed payments, which don't need to be delinquent. So 2 of the payments can be past due, and the 3rd payment could be listed as a current charge. And I also want to highlight that utility shutoff, which is a renter housing crisis, is also a housing crisis for owner-occupant homeowners. All right, so now that we've gone over some of the current policy, I'd like to turn to an overview of the application portal, which is known as the Housing Help Hub. So in the next slide, you'll see the website here, applyhousinghelp.mass.gov. So in order to apply, you or the tenants or the homeowners that you're working with, or the tenants' landlords can visit that site to complete the application. For cases where a landlord is getting paid, both the tenant and the landlord would submit their own application, and then the applications will get matched automatically in the system. However, there are cases where there are applications where no payment is made to a landlord, and those do not require a corresponding vendor application. So for example, homeowner applications don't require a corresponding application from the mortgage servicer. And similarly, utility arrears applications don't require a corresponding application from the utility company. And tenants and homeowners, or you all as their advocates, would need to register once before creating an application. And then they can simply log in and submit new applications when needed. Landlords, they may register before creating their first application or apply as a guest landlord. However, we do strongly encourage account registration for landlords, even though they do have a guest option, because it's just easier for landlords to view and track application status, including things like payment. Okay, so for the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to registration. So registration is really the first step to completing an application and navigating the portal. So to register for a Housing Help Hub account, you can visit applyhousinghelp.mass.gov and locate the Start or Continue an Application box, and then click Get Started as shown on the screen. And then next, you'll get taken to the login page where you'll click register as a new user, as shown here by the arrow in order to get to the user registration page. But note that if you already have an account registered in the application portal, you can just log in to the Housing Help Hub with your existing credentials. And so on this page, you'll see several account registration options, which are presented as scenarios that best describe your role. As tenant or homeowner advocates, you'll select the option that says, I need to help someone else apply, which is shown here by the green arrow. And then on the next slide, after you select, I need to help someone else apply, you'll be given three more specific options. As a tenant advocate, you're going to select, I am assisting someone who needs help with payment, shown here by the arrow. And then on this slide, the last step to register is to fill out the required information, which is shown here on the right, which is going to appear after you select that option of I'm assisting someone who needs help with payment. I do want to highlight that you should use a permanent work email because once the user has been designated, the name and email can't be changed. And also note that if you've registered as an advocate, you won't be allowed to submit an application for yourself under your advocate account. Okay, so next slide. All right, so the previous slides, we went over how to register as an advocate in the Housing Help Hub, but this slide is just here to show you how tenants and homeowners who are applying on their own can register an account. So tenants and homeowners would choose the option that says, I need to apply for help for me or my family, and then they would fill in the required information to create a new account for themselves. In the next slide, now that we've gone over registration, I'd like to actually discuss applying to cases where a landlord will be paid. So the applications can either be started by the landlord or the tenant advocate, and both parties do have to submit an application before any payment can be made. The first step is to log in, following all the prompts on the application, filling out all of the application sections, and then all of the documents that are required are going to be uploaded before the application can be submitted. And the system is going to give you 21 days to complete this step. If the advocate or the tenant submits the tenant application first, the landlord's going to get an email that's auto-generated by the system, and it's going to include the tenant application code, which we'll see shortly. That's when the landlord's going to go in and do their corresponding landlord application. And there's a question in the landlord application that actually asks if the landlord's received the tenant application code. So in this case, the landlord would select yes, and they'd enter that tenant code. And to ensure that the code is correct, we do recommend that the code is copied directly from the email and pasted into the application. And once the landlord completes their application and submits it, the application is going to get automatically matched to the tenant application in the system. In cases where the landlord is the first party to start the application, it's basically the reverse, right? So the landlord would indicate on their application that they don't have a tenant application code since they're the first party submitting. And then when the landlord completes and submits the application, the tenant is going to actually receive the email notification with a landlord application code. And before we get to the next slide, I want to note that in some cases, you might be working with clients who don't have or don't use email. So in those cases, you as their advocate would want to start the application on their behalf. If the landlord initiates the application process, they're going to need to include your advocate email address so that the system emails you the unique code for application matching, since there wouldn't be a tenant email in this case. Okay, so in the next slide, I just want to show you a screenshot of what the beginning of the application looks like for tenants or tenant advocates. In these landlord payment cases, advocates or tenants would fill out the sections here shown, which would be applicant details, hardship, housing crisis, and then you'll see that last section where we ask if they received a landlord code. So if the landlord started the application, it's really important that the advocate or the tenant enter that landlord application code so that the two applications can be matched and then assigned to an RA for review. And I do want to note that we're not going to go through all the application screens today, but I will be highlighting the newly updated tenant portal user guide, which includes tenant advocate instructions and detailed screenshots of each stage of the process. All right, so in the next slide, I'd mentioned that I would show you an example of the tenant application code. So this actually shows examples of emails that you as the tenant advocate and the landlord would receive after a tenant advocate application is submitted successfully. So to the left is the example that you as the advocate would receive. And to the right is the example of the email that the landlord would receive. So you'll see here with the green arrow on the right, the inclusion of that tenant application code. So again, I just want to highlight that to make sure that the applications match, we recommend, strongly recommend that the code is actually copied from the email and pasted directly into the application. Okay, so on the next slide, just very briefly, I'm going to go over cases, again, where, as I had mentioned earlier, no landlord payment is involved, and there's actually no landlord involvement. These would be, again, homeowner applications or applications for something like just utility arrears. So there's no corresponding application for mortgage servicers, utility companies, or other vendors in these cases. And you can see here that there's no corresponding landlord application section compared to the pre-screening screen that we saw for landlord payment cases. And then in the next slide, this is just what, so that was a homeowner application slide. And then in the next slide, or this slide rather, you'll see an application for just utilities. So you'll see here that a yellow kind of caution symbol will actually appear if you indicate that you only need help with utilities and not rent or moving costs. Again, there's no landlord section here. All right, so before we turn it over kind of to resources, I want to go over how to check application status. So once the application has been submitted, the system does allow you to review all open or submitted applications. You'll see here on the right a status bar that actually shows you where each application currently is in the process. And you can edit an application while it's still in draft before it's been submitted. However, applications that have already been submitted can't be edited unless the RAA reviewing the application sends it back to draft for missing information, missing documentation, etc. In which case the applicant would be able to edit again before resubmitting. And there is always the option to upload additional documents to open cases. And importantly for you all as advocates, if a tenant or a homeowner applies on their own, they can log into their account to see the status of their own applications. But as an advocate, if you log in, you're going to see the statuses for all of the applications you've submitted. So that would be for perhaps the multiple tenants that you're assisting. And then in the next slide, I want to highlight the use of our case search page, which is linked here on the slide, but you can also actually navigate to that page from the Housing Help Hub homepage as shown on the left. On the right, you can see the actual case search page where you can quickly look up the case status by simply entering the case number and the associated last name or legal business name. And then in the next slide, we get a lot of questions about what the statuses mean. So this is really meant to show all of the statuses in the portal and what they mean. So not submitted means that the application has been started but not submitted. Again, the applications are going to be deleted after 21 days. Submitted means that the application has been submitted, and if applicable, it's awaiting a match with a landlord application. If an application is under review, it's been matched with a landlord application if applicable, and an RAA is determining eligibility and reviewing documentation. This status may actually also show one of 4 statuses. These include requests for additional information from tenant, requests for additional info from landlord, requests for additional documents from tenant, and requests for additional documents from landlord. Ready for payment, that shows that the application was approved and has been submitted for payment. Checks and direct deposits, they're going to be issued during the RAA's next check run. This status is not applicable to letter of intent applications. The status paid is also not applicable to letter of intent applications, but it means that payment has been issued to the landlord or vendors. And then finally, the application can be closed if it timed out, denied due to ineligibility, or withdrawn, and letter of intent applications can be closed as approved or expired. And I'd also just like to note that you're going to receive an email notification at most of these stages, and the tenant or homeowner that you're assisting will be CC'd on those notifications only if you've provided an email address for them in the application. So the last slide I want to go over, as I had mentioned earlier, is resources available for you all as advocates. You'll see here the first resource is the RAFT Public Resource and Training Portal. I would say that this is probably the most comprehensive and most up-to-date for advocates and community-based organizations and our other partners. This is going to include the most up-to-date trainings, as I had mentioned earlier, as well, a reference guide, including the tenant and landlord portal reference guide, which is below, and also other resources like FAQs. We also have a RAFT eligibility checker tool. This is an optional form that's going to ask a few questions about your client to see if they may be eligible for RAFT. Also a good tool for kind of pre-eligibility. Also these Housing Help Hub user guides, both the tenant portal guide that includes tenant advocate instructions and the landlord portal reference guide have been updated very recently. And then finally, as we won't be able to answer case-specific questions today, I do want to highlight the RAA Finder or the RAA Locator site, which is for case-specific questions or any application assistance needs that would be used to locate and then reach out to the RAA in your area or the RAA that is processing your application. So that's all the slides that I have. I believe the next slide just says questions. So Jackie is going to assist me here with Q&A. And so, yeah, thank you all for joining me today for this presentation part. And now I'd love to turn it over to your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ricky. Thank you so much. So I'm going to invite folks to, I don't see a lot of questions in the chat, but you are welcome to either unmute yourself or drop questions in the chat. Again, specific case questions are going to be directed to RAAs, not to Ricky, but we will share out that information again too to get in touch with them. But yes, okay, so a client of mine moving from shelter to public housing applied for startup help for appliances and furniture, got denied. So this is a specific question, but can you talk a little bit about, like, contextually again about what the process might be, Ricky, for appealing this, or kind of a little bit more like taking a step back about this question in general?
Yeah, so for startup costs, we do have that letter of intent process that I'd just like to briefly highlight. the letter of intent process is really designed for people to kind of get an early start, so you can be found pre-eligible for RAFT, and then show the letter of intent in your housing search process to essentially, indicate that you have been confirmed pre-eligible with prospective landlords, and you have like a 90-day window to do that. However, in terms of, so, I